Atop the frozen hill, under the ash-gray sky that heralded an approaching storm, the lifeless body of a man lay sprawled among the stones, an arrow protruding from his back. The howling wind carried the bitter scent of betrayal. Below, the village seethed with tension, while Sigurd Hrafnsson, the clan's young blacksmith, stared fixedly at the scene. Something awakened inside him. The hidden truth, buried alongside the body, was about to break the ancestral silence. But before he could act, a shadowy figure approached. Sigurd's destiny would forever change. 24 hours earlier, Sigurd awoke to the morning chill invading his modest dwelling. The smoke from the central hearth mingled with the scent of burning wood and damp leather, while the distant rhythm of hammers striking anvils roused the village from slumber. Through gaps in the wooden walls, he could see heavy clouds gathering, promising snow before nightfall. Sigurd ran calloused fingers through his dark blonde hair, disheveled from restless sleep. At 28 winters, his shoulders already bore the weight of responsibility passed down from his father, maintaining every weapon, tool, and piece of armor that kept their clan alive through the harsh northern seasons. His blue eyes reflected the flicker of dying embers as he contemplated the day ahead, the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. "Another day of beating metal into submission," he muttered to himself, reaching for his worn woolen tunic. The fabric scratched against the small runic tattoo on his left wrist, a protection symbol his father had insisted upon before his passing 5 winters ago. The memory of Hraf's death still haunted him. Not in glorious battle as a warrior should fall, but slowly, painfully, from a wasting illness that left Sigurd alone to carry on their essential craft. The leather boots he pulled on were hardened from years of use, molded perfectly to feet accustomed to standing from dawn until dusk. Rising to his full height, Sigurd ducked beneath the low doorframe and stepped into the biting cold of early morning. The village was already stirring, women carrying water from the well, children chasing one another between longhouses, old men huddled near communal fires, sharing tales they'd told 100 times before. Sigurd's gaze drifted toward the great hall that dominated the center of their settlement. Smoke rose from its roof vents, signaling that Gudmund Eriksson, their clan chief, was already holding council with his trusted advisers. The old man's authority was absolute, his judgment rarely questioned. But lately, whispers had begun to circulate about decisions made in shadows, alliances formed and broken without explanation. "Sigurd, the chief wants new arrowheads by midday," called Torsten, one of Gudmund's younger warriors, his breath visible in the frigid air. "The hunting party leaves at first light tomorrow." Sigurd nodded, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. More weapons, always more weapons. Not for hunting deer or boar, he suspected, but for the ongoing feud with the neighboring clan, a blood debt that had spanned 3 generations with no end in sight. The path to his forge took him past the edge of the forest. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with frost, dark against the lightning sky. Something about their stillness made him pause. The usual morning sounds, birds calling, small animals rustling through underbrush, were absent. The silence felt unnatural, heavy with foreboding. That's when he heard it, a soft whimper, barely audible above the wind. Sigurd froze, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt. Again the sound came. Not an animal in distress, but something more human, more vulnerable. Following the noise, he pushed through the thicket of frost-covered bushes, branches scraping against his face and catching in his short beard. In a small clearing, huddled against the base of a massive pine, was a child. A girl, no more than 7 winters old, her small body trembling violently from cold and fear. Her once fair hair hung in tangled, dirty strands around a face smeared with dirt and tears. The simple tunic she wore was torn and inadequate against the bitter cold. Around her neck hung a broken silver pendant, the chain snapped as if torn forcibly away. Sigurd's heart hammered against his ribs. Children were precious in their harsh world. To find one abandoned in the forest was unthinkable. Yet something about her struck him as wrong, dangerous even. He should alert the village, bring others to witness this discovery. The girl's eyes fluttered open, pale gray like the winter sky, wide with terror. When she saw him, she pressed herself harder against the tree, a cornered animal expecting only further harm. One small hand clutched protectively at her right wrist, but not before Sigurd glimpsed what she was hiding. A small but distinct runic tattoo, the mark of their enemy clan. In that moment, understanding crashed over him like ice water. This was no ordinary lost child. She belonged to the clan of Ulfric Gudmundsson, their sworn enemies who had raided their shores and slaughtered their people for generations. To harbor her would be seen as the highest treason. To reveal her would surely mean her death. Time seemed to slow as Sigurd weighed his choices. The wise decision, the safe decision, would be to walk away, or worse, to drag her before Gudmund as proof of their enemy's weakness. His position in the clan was already precarious. The blacksmith was respected, but not loved, necessary, but not trusted completely. This could secure his standing, or destroy everything. The girl's lips moved, forming words in a dialect similar to his own, yet distinctly foreign. "Please," she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of immeasurable suffering. "They will kill me." Sigurd glanced back toward the village, smoke rising peacefully from multiple hearths. His people, his safety, his life. Then he looked at the child again, small, defenseless, doomed without intervention. Something deeper than reason, older than clan loyalty, stirred within him. Before his mind could fully process the consequences, his body had made the decision. "Come," he said softly, extending his hand. "Quickly now, and stay silent if you wish to live." Her small, dirt-encrusted fingers hesitated, then grasped his calloused palm with surprising strength. As he lifted her from the frozen ground, Sigurd knew with absolute certainty that this moment would change everything. He was opening a wound long festering in the history of both clans, a truth that, once unearthed, could never be buried again. The forge stood at the village's edge, far enough from the mean dwellings that the constant hammering and heat wouldn't disturb others, yet close enough to be protected within the settlement's boundaries. Sigurd glanced nervously over his shoulder as he led the child through the back entrance, grateful for the early hour when few would notice his return or question why he carried a bundle of old furs. Inside, the banked coals from yesterday still glowed faintly red. Sigurd quickly built up the fire, not for smithing, but for warmth. The girl stood frozen where he'd left her, eyes darting around the unfamiliar space like a trapped animal seeking escape. Tools hung from the walls, hammers, tongs, punches, and chisels, along with finished works awaiting collection. Axe heads, knife blades, arrow points, and more delicate pieces like brooches and arm rings. "You're safe here," Sigurd said. though he knew the words rang hollow. Nowhere was truly safe for her, not in this village, not in this life they lived. Come closer to the fire. She took hesitant steps forward, her small body still trembling uncontrollably. Sigurd wrapped one of his wool cloaks around her shoulders, the fabric engulfing her tiny frame. Her skin felt like ice beneath his touch, her lips tinged with blue. How long had she been in the forest? How had she even survived the night? Here, he offered a wooden cup of water and a piece of bread left from his morning meal. Eat, drink. The child stared at the offerings suspiciously before hunger overcame caution. She devoured the bread in desperate bites, gulping water between mouthfuls. Sigurd watched her, mind racing. He needed to know who she was, how she came to be alone in the forest, what danger followed her. But patience would serve better than demands. When she'd finished eating, her eyes met his directly for the first time. Despite her fear and exhaustion, there was something fierce in that gaze, something unbroken. "What is your name?" Sigurd asked gently, keeping his voice low. She hesitated, clearly weighing whether to trust him with even this small piece of herself. "Ira," she finally whispered, the word barely audible over the crackling fire. "Ira," he repeated, nodding slowly. "I am Sigurd Hrothsson." At the mention of his clan name, her eyes widened slightly. So she understood who he was, who his people were to hers. Yet she didn't shrink away, perhaps recognizing that her survival now depended entirely on this stranger who should, by all rights, be her enemy. "Your wrist," Sigurd said, gesturing to where she still protectively covered the small tattoo. "May I see?" Reluctantly, Ira extended her arm. The mark was small but unmistakable, the sigil of Ulfric's bloodline, given only to those of direct descent. This was no ordinary child of the rival clan. She was of the chieftain's own blood. The implications made Sigurd's mouth go dry with fear. "You are Ulfric's daughter," he stated rather than asked. Ira nodded once, her eyes never leaving his face, gauging his reaction. "They came in the night," she said, her voice stronger now. "Men with painted faces, not your clan, others. They killed my guards. I ran." Sigurd's mind raced. A third party attacking Ulfric's family? Mercenaries, perhaps, hired by someone with enough wealth and hatred to risk the consequences? Or raiders from even further shores, seeing opportunity in the ongoing feud between neighboring clans? "How did you get here?" he asked. Their settlements were separated by nearly half a day's journey through difficult terrain. "I ran," she repeated simply, "then hid, then ran more. The wolves came." Her voice faltered. "I climbed a tree, stayed until morning, then ran again." Sigurd marveled at her resilience. Many grown warriors would have succumbed to the cold, the fear, the wolves. This child had survived through sheer will. "And now?" she asked, a question that contained multitudes. What would he do with her? Would he turn her over to his chief? Use her as a bargaining piece? Kill her himself to avenge past wrongs? Before Sigurd could answer, the forge door swung open. He lunged to his feet, instinctively moving to block the child from view, but he was too slow. Frida, the herb woman who often brought him tinctures for tempering metal, stood in the doorway, her keen eyes taking in the scene. The untouched forge, the huddled child, Sigurd's protective stance. "Close the door," Sigurd said quickly, heart pounding. "Please." To his surprise, Frida stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind her. Her weathered face revealed nothing as she approached, looking down at Eira with an unreadable expression. You bring danger into our midst, blacksmith. This child bears the mark of our enemy. She was alone in the forest, Sigurd replied, not backing down. Would you have me leave her to die? Frida's eyes narrowed. Perhaps that would have been kinder than what awaits when others discover her presence. She knelt before Era, her movement surprisingly fluid for a woman of her years. With gentle fingers, she tilted the child's face upward, examining her features. You have your mother's eyes, child. Sigurd stared at Frida in shock. You know her? A bitter smile crossed the older woman's face. I know more than most would believe. More than our chief would have remembered. She rose stiffly. This discovery will not remain secret for long. Already Ulfric's men scour the forests, and soon they will approach our borders, seeking what is lost. What should I do? Sigurd asked, the question escaping before he could stop himself. Frida gave him a long, measuring look. You've already made your choice, haven't you? The moment you brought her across our threshold. She moved toward the door, then paused. I will bring food and clean clothing. Say nothing to anyone else. When the storm breaks, and break it will, stand firm in your truth. With those cryptic words, she slipped out, leaving Sigurd and Era alone once more. The girl looked up at him, understanding far more than her years should allow. They will kill you for helping me, she said simply. Sigurd couldn't disagree. Instead, he stoked the fire higher, the familiar action steadying his nerves. Rest now, he told her. We will face what comes when it comes. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the first snowflakes of what promised to be a fierce storm, a fitting herald for the tempest about to engulf them all. By midday, Sigurd had managed to complete some work, enough to avoid immediate suspicion about his productivity. Era had fallen into exhausted sleep, curled in a nest of furs in the small storage room adjacent to the main forge. He checked on her periodically, each time struck by how vulnerable she appeared in sleep, the wariness temporarily erased from her features. Frida had returned as promised, bringing a small bundle containing a clean tunic that must have belonged to a village child years ago, dried meat, cheese, and a small stoppered flask she described only as for strength. She'd also brought news. Ulfric's warriors had been spotted at the forest's edge, their manner making it clear they searched for something of great importance. The council gathers, she'd told him quietly. Gudmund has called his advisers to discuss the unusual movement of our enemies so close to our borders. Now, as Sigurd hammered methodically at a piece of glowing iron, shaping it into one of the arrowheads Torsten had requested, his mind raced through possibilities, each more desperate than the last. He could attempt to smuggle Era out, perhaps to the coastal settlements where attitudes toward clan rivalries were more relaxed. But winter's grip made travel nearly impossible, and he had no allies to call upon for such a dangerous journey. He could reveal her presence himself, frame it as capturing an enemy spy, but the thought made him physically ill. Once she was in Gudmund's hands, her fate would be sealed, and the cycle of violence would continue, perhaps even escalate to full-scale war. Or he could continue hiding her, hoping against hope that Ulfric's search would move elsewhere, that spring would come early, that some miracle would present a solution. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Sigurd quickly thrust the unfinished arrowhead back into the coals, wiping sweat from his brow as the forge door swung open. He expected Frida again, or perhaps Torsten checking on his commission. Instead, Bjorn Grimson filled the doorway, his massive frame blocking the winter light. As Gudmund's most trusted warrior and enforcer, Bjorn's presence never heralded good news. "The chief summons you," Bjorn stated without preamble, his voice a low rumble that matched his bear-like appearance. His eyes swept the forge suspiciously. "Why do you burn your fire so high today, blacksmith? The smoke from your chimney rises like a signal fire." Sigurd forced his features to remain neutral, though his heart hammered painfully against his ribs. "Metalwork requires consistent heat," he replied evenly. "What does Gudmund require of me?" "Weapons assessment. He wants inventory of all battle-ready arms." Bjorn's gaze continued to roam the workshop. "Immediately." There was no refusing such a summons. To delay would only increase suspicion. Sigurd set down his hammer with deliberate calm. "I'll need to bank the forge first," he said, moving toward the fire. "Leave it," Bjorn commanded. "This won't wait." Panic flared in Sigurd's chest. If he left now, Ira would be alone and vulnerable. If the fire burned unchecked, it could become dangerous. If it died out completely, the child would freeze. "It's unsafe," he began. "Since when does a blacksmith fear fire?" Bjorn's hand moved to the hilt of his sword, a gesture more threat than casual movement. "The chief waits, Hrafnsson." Sigurd had no choice. With one last glance toward the storage room door, firmly closed, thank the gods, he followed Bjorn out into the swirling snow. The storm had worsened, visibility reduced to mere arm's lengths ahead. Perfect weather for concealing movement. Or an attack. The great hall loomed before them, its carved wooden pillars decorated with intricate patterns of intertwined beasts and ancient runes. Inside, the vast space was warmed by multiple hearths, the smoke rising to escape through vents in the high roof. At the far end, seated on a chair elevated slightly above the floor, Gudmund Eriksson Eriksson surveyed his gathered advisers with the calculating gaze that had kept him in power for over 2 decades. At 52 winters, Gudmund remained imposing, his gray-streaked hair pulled back in a tight braid, his weathered face marked by a prominent scar across his forehead, testament to battles long past. The heavy wolf fur cloak around his shoulders emphasized his authority, as did the iron bracelets encircling his wrists. "Sigurd Hrafnsson," he acknowledged, as Bjorn ushered the blacksmith forward. "What news from the village edge? Have you seen movement in the forests?" The question caught Sigurd off guard. Was this truly about weapons inventory, or had Gudmund somehow learned of Ira already? "Only the usual winter stillness, chief," he answered carefully. "Game is scarce this season." Gudmund's dark eyes narrowed slightly. "And yet Ulfric's hunters creep along our boundaries like foxes around a henhouse. What would bring them so close, I wonder?" Before Sigurd could formulate a response, the hall doors burst open, admitting a blast of cold air and snow, and 3 warriors dragging a 4th man between them. The captive wore the distinctive black wool cloak of Ulfric's clan, now torn and bloodied from what appeared to have been a brief but violent struggle. "Found him just within our marker stones," reported Knut, the leader of the border patrol. "He claims to come under peace banner, but carried this." He tossed a short sword onto the rush-covered floor before Gudmund's seat. The chief rose slowly, his gaze never leaving the prisoner's face. "Peace banner? Ulfric sends warriors armed with steel to speak of peace. A humorless smile curved beneath his full beard. "Explain yourself before I have your tongue removed to ensure your silence is permanent." The man raised his head, revealing a face streaked with blood from a gash above his eye. Despite his precarious position, he maintained dignity. "I am Hakon, sword-arm to Chief Ulfric Gudmundsson," he stated clearly. "I come seeking information, not battle. A child is missing from our settlement, the chief's youngest daughter. We track her to your forest's edge." Murmurs rippled through the gathered advisors. Sigurd felt cold sweat trickle down his spine despite the hall's warmth. "And you believe we have taken her?" Gudmund's voice remained dangerously calm. "That we steal children in the night like creatures from old tales?" Hakon shook his head carefully. "We believe she fled after an attack. Raiders came 2 nights past, masked men who slaughtered her guards and attempted to take her. She escaped them, but a child alone in winter." He left the obvious conclusion unspoken. "Convenient tale," Gudmund observed coldly. "Perhaps Ulfric simply seeks excuse to cross our boundaries with armed men." "The chief offers Wergild," Hakon continued steadily. "Gold, silver, and 10 prime horses to any who return his daughter unharmed. Double to any who bring the heads of those who attacked our settlement." This announcement caused even greater stir among the gathered men. Such payment would make a man wealthy beyond common dreams. Gudmund settled back into his chair, fingers drumming thoughtfully on the carved armrest. "And if we find this missing child, what guarantee do we have that Ulfric won't claim we were the attackers all along? That this isn't some elaborate trap to justify full assault on our lands?" Hakon reached slowly into his tunic, causing the guards to tense, but withdrew only a small object wrapped in leather. "The child wears Ulfric's mark on her wrist. She also carried this, half of an ancient amulet, split when our clans first divided generations ago. The chief holds the matching piece. When joined, they will prove her identity beyond question." Sigurd couldn't breathe. The broken silver pendant around Ira's neck, could it be this significant artifact? If so, she was even more valuable than he'd first realized. Gudmund took the wrapped object, examining it briefly, before passing it to his advisor, an older man named Gorm, who had knowledge of ancient matters. "Search the village," Gudmund ordered his men. "Every dwelling, every storage hut, every animal pen. If this child is within our boundaries, I want her found." Sigurd's world narrowed to a roaring in his ears. They would search the forge. They would find Ira. Everything would unravel. "Chief," he heard himself speak, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "May I return to my forge, the weapons inventory?" "We'll wait," Gudmund cut him off sharply. "No one leaves until this search is complete." Trapped in the great hall, Sigurd could only pray to gods he rarely acknowledged that Ira would somehow remain hidden, that Frida might return and move her to safer keeping, that some miracle would prevent disaster. But as the afternoon wore into evening, with periodic reports from search parties returning empty-handed, Sigurd's hope dwindled. When Bjorn himself announced he would check the outlying structures, including the smithy, Sigurd knew time had run out. He had to act now, before all was lost. "Chief Gudmund," he called out, his voice stronger than he felt, "I request private audience. I have information relevant to this matter." The hall fell silent. Gudmund studied him with renewed interest, then nodded once. "Clear the hall," he commanded, "except for Bjorn and Gorm." As the others filed out, some casting curious glances back at Sigurd, he steeled himself for what must come next. Truth was his only remaining weapon. Truth, and the desperate hope that somewhere beneath Gudmund's hardened exterior remained enough humanity to spare an innocent child. When the massive doors closed behind the last departing advisor, Gudmund leaned forward. "Speak, blacksmith. What information do you hold that requires such privacy?" Sigurd drew a deep breath. "The child Ulfric seeks. I found her this morning at the forest's edge." Bjorn's hand immediately went to his weapon, but Gudmund raised a hand, stopping him. "Continue," he ordered Sigurd, his expression unreadable. "She was half frozen, exhausted, clearly having fled through the night. She bears the mark Håkon described, and wears a broken silver pendant." Sigurd held Gudmund's gaze steadily. "I took her to my forge. She sleeps there now." The silence that followed seemed endless. Finally, Gudmund spoke, his voice deceptively soft. "You found an enemy's child. Rather than bringing her to your chief, you concealed her presence. You listened as I ordered a search, saying nothing. Each statement fell like a hammer blow. Give me one reason why I shouldn't have you executed for treason, Sigurd Rafson." "Because she is a child," Sigurd replied simply. "Because our quarrel is not with children. Because enough blood has soaked into our shared lands." Gudmund's laugh held no humor. "Noble sentiments from a man who forges weapons of death." He rose from his chair, suddenly seeming larger, more imposing. "Bring her to me, now. We will determine what to do with both of you after I've seen this supposedly innocent child for myself." There was no choice but to obey. Flanked by Bjorn, Sigurd trudged through the deepening snow back to his forge, dread weighing heavier with each step. The building appeared undisturbed, smoke still rising steadily from its chimney. Inside, the fire burned low but steady, casting long shadows across the workshop. "Ira," Sigurd called softly, moving toward the storage room. "Come out. I need you to meet someone." No answer came. With increasing alarm, Sigurd pushed open the small door, only to find the room empty, the furs disturbed as it hastily abandoned. "She's gone," he breathed, genuine shock replacing his fear. Bjorn growled in suspicion, searching the small space himself, even thrusting his sword into the pile of furs. "If you've helped her escape—" "I haven't," Sigurd protested. "She was here when I left. Someone must have taken her." But who? Frida, perhaps? Or had Ira, frightened by his absence, fled back into the forest? The thought of her alone again in the worsening storm made his blood run cold. A sharp knock at the forge door interrupted his frantic thoughts. Bjorn yanked it open, revealing a sight that froze them both in place. There stood Ulfric Gudmundsson himself, flanked by 4 warriors, snow dusting their dark cloaks and hair. The rival chief's appearance was as intimidating as the stories claimed, tall and broad-shouldered despite his 45 years, with black hair pulled back in a tight knot, revealing a face marked by old pox scars and dominated by a deep scar that ran from temple to jaw on the right side. His gray eyes held the coldness of midwinter ice. And directly before him, tiny in comparison, stood Ira, unharmed but clearly in her father's custody once more. "I believe," Ulfric said, his deep voice carrying easily despite the howling wind, "that we have matters to discuss with Gudmund." The great hall had never felt more tense. At one end stood Gudmund with his advisors and warriors, at the other Ulfric with his smaller but equally formidable entourage. Between them, Sigurd and Ira stood like pieces on a game board, their fates to be decided by forces beyond their control. "Your man claims the child fled to him for protection," Gudmund stated, addressing Ulfric directly. "That unknown attackers targeted her specifically." Ulfric's cold gaze never wavered. "The attack was real. 6 of my best warriors died defending the settlement. The raiders came in darkness, faces blackened with ash and mud. They spoke no words, left no survivors except those who hid." His large hand rested protectively on Ira's shoulder. "My daughter showed remarkable courage, escaping into the forest rather than falling into their hands." "And you believe these attackers were not of my clan?" Gudmund's tone suggested he found this difficult to accept. "Had they been your men, they would have worn your colors proudly," Ulfric replied with cold certainty. "Your kind has many faults, Eriksson, but lack of pride in slaughter is not among them." The insult hung in the air, but Gudmund merely smiled thinly. "Then we face a common enemy, someone who seeks to reignite war between our clans, someone who benefits from our mutual destruction." Sigurd watched the exchange with growing unease. The 2 chiefs circled each other like wolves preparing to fight, each searching for weakness, advantage, or truth, perhaps all 3. "Your blacksmith," Ulfric said suddenly, turning his attention to Sigurd. "He sheltered my daughter when he could have turned her over to you for whatever fate you deemed appropriate. Why?" All eyes shifted to Sigurd. He felt the weight of their collective judgment, the precariousness of his position. One wrong word could mean death, not just for him, but potentially for many others if war erupted. "I saw a child in need," he answered simply, "not an enemy." Ulfric studied him with those penetrating gray eyes. A rare perspective in these times. He turned back to Gudmund. "I came prepared for battle, expecting to find my daughter's body, or worse. Instead, I find she was given shelter by one of yours. This complicates matters." "Indeed," Gudmund agreed coldly. "It raises questions about the loyalty of those within my clan." His dark gaze fixed on Sigurd, questions that demand answers. Ira, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, suddenly stepped forward. Despite her diminutive size among these imposing warriors, her voice rang clear in the hall. "He saved my life," she stated firmly. "The wolves would have taken me had he not found me. And he knew what I was, who I was, yet still offered protection." "The innocence of children," Gudmund remarked dismissively. "They see simple kindness where adults recognize the complexities of loyalty and betrayal." "Perhaps," Ulfric countered, "children see truth more clearly, unburdened by the weight of old hatreds." A strange tension filled the hall, not the familiar animosity of enemies facing each other across a battlefield, but something more unsettling, the discomfort of long-held beliefs being questioned. Frida chose that moment to step forward from among Gudmund's advisors. Her weathered face revealed nothing, but her eyes held a fierce intensity as she addressed both chiefs. "The pendant," she said. "Show them the pendant, child." All attention turned to Ira, who hesitantly reached beneath her cloak to withdraw the broken silver object Sigurd had noticed earlier. In the firelight, its intricate engravings became visible, half of a circular design, the edge jagged where it had been forcibly separated from its counterpart. Gorm, Goodman's elderly adviser, inhaled sharply. "The blood oath medallion," he murmured. "I thought it lost generations ago." Ulfric reached within his own tunic, producing what was clearly the matching half. "Not lost," he corrected, "hidden, preserved by those who remembered the original purpose." Goodman's expression darkened. "Speak plainly, Goodmanson. What game do you play?" "No game," Ulfric replied, his voice gaining an edge. "Truth, buried by our grandfathers, denied by our fathers, forgotten by most, until now." He looked down at his daughter. "Until her." Frida moved to stand beside Ira, her presence somehow protective. "The medallion was split when blood was spilled between brothers, the founding fathers of both your lines," she explained. "It was decreed that only when the halves were rejoined by innocent hands could the blood debt be considered settled." "Superstitious nonsense," Goodman dismissed, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "Is it?" Ulfric challenged. "The attacks on my settlement targeted my youngest child specifically, the one who bears not only my blood, but also carries this." He indicated the pendant. "Someone knows the old stories. Someone fears what reconciliation between our clans might mean for their own power." The implication hung heavy in the air. If neither clan had orchestrated the recent attacks, then a third party sought to manipulate them both. Someone who benefited from their continued enmity. Sigurd watched realization dawn on faces throughout the hall. The possibility of a common enemy, perhaps coastal raiders who had long exploited the division between the two strongest inland clans, shifted the entire foundation of their worldview. "The child found her way to your blacksmith for a reason," Frida stated with quiet certainty. "Not chance, not coincidence. The old gods still watch, still guide when the need is great enough." Goodman's laugh held more discomfort than derision. "You suggest we set aside generations of blood feud because of a broken trinket and an old woman's superstitions?" "I suggest," Ulfric replied evenly, "that we consider what continued war costs us both, while others grow stronger at our expense." His gaze swept the hall. "I came prepared to leave with either my daughter or your head on a spear, Eriksson. Instead, I find myself contemplating possibilities I had not considered in many years." Sigurd felt a shift in the hall's atmosphere, subtle but unmistakable. Warriors on both sides straightened, hands moving fractionally away from weapon hilts. Advisors exchanged glances, calculating new possibilities. "And what of him?" Gudmund demanded, pointing at Sigurd. "The blacksmith who defied his chief, concealed an enemy within our borders? What becomes of such disloyalty in this new world you propose?" Ira moved then, small fingers reaching out to grasp Sigurd's hand. The gesture, simple but profound, silenced the hall more effectively than any shout. "He saw me as a child first, an enemy second," she said, her young voice steady despite the tension surrounding her. "Perhaps that is what we all must learn." Sigurd looked down at the girl beside him, marveling at her courage. In protecting her, had he somehow set in motion events that might heal wounds festering for generations? Or had he merely postponed the inevitable clash between forces too deeply entrenched in hatred to change? Gudmund and Ulfric stared at each other across the hall, two proud men, each bearing the weight of their ancestors' choices, each responsible for the lives of their people. The moment stretched, balanced on a knife's edge between continued enmity and the first tentative step towards something new. Finally, Gudmund spoke, his voice carrying the weariness of age and responsibility. "The storm worsens. No one travels tonight. We will provide quarters for Ulfric and his men under truce banner." He fixed his rival with a hard stare. "Tomorrow we will speak further of these possibilities." It wasn't peace, it wasn't even reconciliation, but it was more than either clan had offered the other in living memory. As the hall slowly emptied, arrangements being made to house the unexpected guests, Sigurd found himself standing alone with Ira once more. Ulfric had reluctantly allowed his daughter a moment to speak with the man who had sheltered her, though he watched from a short distance, his expression guarded. "You risked everything for me," Ira said softly, her gray eyes solemn. "Why?" Sigurd considered the question carefully. "Perhaps because I recognized something in you, a courage that had nothing to do with clan or blood. Or, perhaps," he added with the ghost of a smile, "I simply couldn't leave a child to the wolves, no matter whose child she might be." "My father is not the monster your people believe," she told him earnestly, "nor is yours the evil my people claim." "Men rarely are what legends make them," Sigurd agreed. "We are all simply trying to survive, to protect what we love." Ira nodded, wisdom beyond her years shining in her eyes. "Will you be punished for helping me?" Sigurd glanced toward Gudmund, who stood in deep conversation with his advisors. "That remains to be seen, but I would make the same choice again, knowing the consequences." The child reached up, removing the broken pendant from around her neck. She pressed it into his palm, closing his fingers around it. "Then keep this safe for me," she whispered, "until tomorrow, when perhaps it can become whole again." Before he could respond, Ulfric called his daughter back to his side. With one last meaningful glance, Ira rejoined her father, disappearing into the group of warriors who formed a protective circle around them. Left alone, Sigurd opened his hand to stare at the ancient silver fragment. In the flickering firelight, the runes etched along its edge seemed to shift and change, speaking of old promises, blood oaths, and the possibility of redemption. Outside, the storm howled, snow blanketing the village in pristine white. By morning, all tracks would be covered, the landscape transformed. Perhaps, Sigurd thought, as he carefully tucked the medallion into his tunic, their lives might undergo a similar transformation. Old hatreds buried beneath the possibility of a new beginning. But first, they would have to survive the night. A night with enemies sleeping beneath the same roof. Centuries of distrust temporarily set aside, and unknown forces still moving in the shadows, seeking to ensure that reconciliation never came to pass. The longest night of winter stretched before them, filled with whispered counsels, uneasy dreams, and the weight of decisions that would echo through generations to come. Dawn broke reluctantly over the snow-covered village, pale light filtering through clouds that still promised more snow before day's end. Sigurd had slept little, his mind racing with possibilities and dangers that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. He'd been confined to a small storage room adjacent to the great hall, not formally imprisoned, but clearly not trusted to move freely while Ulfric's party remained within their walls. As he splashed cold water on his face from a basin left by a servant, the doors swung open to reveal Bjorn's massive frame. "The chiefs summon you," the warrior stated without preamble. His expression revealed nothing of what awaited. Sigurd followed him through the quiet settlement. Morning activities had begun, smoke rising from cooking fires, livestock being tended, but an unusual hush hung over everything. Word of Ulfric's presence had spread, leaving people moving cautiously, speaking in whispers, eyes darting toward the great hall with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Inside, the hall had been rearranged. The two chiefs now sat across from each other at a long table, their closest advisers flanking them on either side. No weapons were visible, though Sigurd had no doubt each man remained armed in less obvious ways. Ira sat slightly behind her father, her small face solemn but composed. "Approach, blacksmith," Gudmund commanded, his voice betraying nothing of his thoughts. Sigurd moved forward, conscious of every eye upon him. He stopped at a respectful distance from the table, inclining his head to both leaders. "We have reached certain understandings during the night," Gudmund continued, "matters that concern you directly." Ulfric studied Sigurd with that penetrating gray gaze. "My daughter speaks highly of you. She believes your intervention was guided by the gods themselves." "I claim no divine inspiration," Sigurd replied carefully, "only the unwillingness to see a child suffer." "Nevertheless," Ulfric continued, "your actions preserved what may prove to be our best hope for lasting peace." He gestured to Frida, who stepped forward carrying an age-darkened wooden box. The herb woman placed the box on the table between the chiefs, then stepped back, her eyes never leaving Sigurd's face. "Show them what the child entrusted to you," she instructed. With growing unease, Sigurd withdrew the broken medallion from within his tunic. In daylight, its craftsmanship became even more apparent. Intricate knotwork surrounding runes of protection and binding, the silver still gleaming despite its age. Gudmund's expression darkened. "So you took not only an enemy child into your protection, but also an artifact of significant value?" "It was freely given," Sigurd defended himself, though he knew how weak such claims would sound. "And freely must it be returned," Frida interjected, "if the old magic is to work." Ulfric opened the wooden box, revealing its contents, the matching half of the medallion, nestled in faded red cloth. "Our clans were not always enemies," he said, addressing the entire assembly. 5 generations ago, we were one people, led by 2 brothers who shared power and purpose. When blood was shed between them, the circumstances lost to time. This medallion was broken, symbolizing the sundering of our bloodlines. Gudmund's skepticism remained evident, but he didn't interrupt as Ulfric continued. "It was prophesied that only when the pieces were rejoined by innocent hands, freely given and freely received, could the blood debt be considered settled." Ulfric looked toward his daughter. Ira's mother came from a line of knowledge keepers, women who preserved the old ways when men were too consumed with vengeance to remember. Before her death, she entrusted this knowledge to our daughter, along with half the medallion. "Convenient tales," Gudmund remarked dryly. "Yet I note your warriors remain armed, as do mine. True trust seems in short supply, despite these ancient stories." "The first steps towards peace are always taken on uncertain ground," Ulfric acknowledged. "But consider this. What if the attacks on my settlement were designed specifically to prevent this moment? What if someone fears our unity more than our continued conflict? Murmurs rippled through both groups of advisors. The possibility had clearly been discussed during the night, gaining credibility with each passing hour. Coastal raiders grow bolder each season, Gorm, Goodman's elderly advisor, pointed out. They exploit our division, attacking one clan while knowing the other will not come to their aid. And traders extract higher prices from us both, added one of Ulfric's men, knowing we cannot unite to demand better terms. Goodman leaned forward, fingers steepled before him. Pretty words and ancient trinkets make poor shields against arrows, Goodmanson. What exactly do you propose? A trial period, Ulfric replied promptly. 3 moons of truce. Trading parties may cross boundaries without fear. Shared hunting grounds in the disputed territories. At winter's end, we meet again to determine if permanent peace serves both our interests. It was more than anyone had dared hope for, yet less than complete reconciliation. A cautious first step rather than a leap of faith. Goodman's eyes narrowed in calculation. And what guarantee do I have that this isn't merely a ploy to lower our defenses before you strike? The same guarantee I have against similar treachery from you, Ulfric countered evenly. None, except our word, bound by the old ways. He gestured toward the broken medallion. And this. All eyes turned to the ancient artifact. Sigurd felt the weight of history pressing down upon them all, generations of hatred and bloodshed potentially balanced against a fragile hope for something better. The blacksmith, Goodman said suddenly. What becomes of him? He betrayed his clan's interests, harbored an enemy. He saved my daughter's life, Ulfric replied. In the old ways, that creates a blood debt that cannot be ignored. So you would claim him as yours? Goodman's voice held a dangerous edge. Take one of our few skilled craftsmen as some sort of prize? Ulfric shook his head. Not as prize, as bridge. He turned to Sigurd directly. You stand between our worlds now, Hrafsson, neither fully of one clan nor the other. I propose you serve as intermediary during this trial period, traveling freely between our settlements, carrying messages, ensuring the terms of our truce are observed by both sides. Sigurd felt as if the ground shifted beneath his feet. Such a role would be fraught with danger, suspected by both sides, trusted fully by neither. Yet it also offered unprecedented opportunity to help forge a lasting peace. And if I refuse? He asked quietly. Goodman's laugh held no humor. Then you remain here, under my judgment for your actions. I have not yet decided if they constitute treason worthy of death. While I would be honor-bound to demand blood price for the one who saved my child, Ulfric added, creating the very conflict we seek to avoid. Trapped between impossible choices, Sigurd found his gaze drawn to Eira. The child watched him steadily, her expression conveying both apology for his predicament and confidence in his decision. I will serve as intermediary, he said finally, if it brings us closer to peace. Relief visibly rippled through both delegations. Whatever their reservations about the arrangement, none wished to see the fragile truce shattered before it truly began. Then let us complete what was begun, Frida announced, stepping forward once more. The rejoining of what was sundered in the sight of gods and men. At her gesture, Eira rose and moved to stand before the table. Ulfric placed his half of the medallion in her small palm. With quiet dignity, the child turned toward Sigurd, clearly expecting him to approach. He did so, conscious of the historical weight of the moment. Carefully, he placed the half-medallion Ira had entrusted to him the night before into her waiting hand. The child looked solemnly from one chief to the other. The blood of brothers should nourish our shared roots, not stain our shared soil, she recited, clearly repeating words taught to her by her mother. What was broken in anger, let it be mended in wisdom. With those words, she brought the two halves together. For a breathless moment, nothing happened. Then, to the astonishment of all present, the jagged edges seemed to soften, the ancient silver flowing like water to rejoin its missing piece. A faint blue light rippled across the surface of the now complete medallion, the runes briefly glowing before fading back to normal. Gasps and murmurs filled the hall. Even Gudmund, for all his skepticism, leaned forward with widened eyes. "The old magic still lives," Frida stated simply, as if this confirmed what she had always known. Ira held the reunited medallion reverently, then placed it on the table between the two chiefs. "It belongs to both of you now," she said, "and to neither alone." Gudmund and Ulfric stared at the artifact, then at each other. Something unspoken passed between them. Not friendship, not yet trust, but perhaps the first fragile recognition of a shared destiny. 3 moons, Gudmund stated finally. A trial period, as proposed. The blacksmith will serve as intermediary. He fixed Sigurd with a hard stare. "Remember where you were born, Hrafnsson, even as you walk between worlds." "And remember who saved your life," Ulfric added meaningfully, "when others would have ended it without question." Sigurd inclined his head to both men, accepting the precarious position that fate, or the gods, had thrust upon him. "I will serve truth above all," he promised, "for without it no lasting peace is possible." Outside, the snow had stopped falling. Thin sunlight broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the white landscape. As Ulfric's party prepared to depart, villagers gathered at a cautious distance, watching this unprecedented moment with mixture of fear, curiosity, and fragile hope. Ira approached Sigurd one last time before mounting the small pony her father had provided for her journey home. "You will come to our settlement soon?" she asked, her voice betraying a child's worry beneath the formal occasion. "Within a fortnight," he assured her, kneeling to meet her eyes directly. "My first duty as intermediary." She nodded solemnly, then surprised him by throwing her arms around his neck in a quick, fierce embrace. "The gods chose well," she whispered in his ear, before pulling away. As he watched the party depart, Sigurd felt Frida's presence beside him. The old woman's weathered face revealed little, but her eyes held a gleam of satisfaction. "You knew?" he accused quietly. "From the moment you saw her in my forge, you knew who she was, what she carried." Frida's smile was enigmatic. "I knew possibilities," she corrected. "The future is never certain, Sigurd Rafsson. Even now, many paths stretch before us all, some leading to peace, others returning to the old hatreds." "And which do you foresee?" he asked, unable to keep the edge of bitterness from his voice. His life had been irrevocably changed, his position in the clan forever altered. "That depends largely on you," she replied, patting his arm with surprising gentleness. "The bridge builder, the in-between man, neither fully trusted, yet essential to both." With those cryptic words, she moved away, leaving Sigurd alone with his thoughts. Around him, the village began returning to normal routines, though whispers followed him wherever he went. Some looked at him with newfound respect, others with suspicion or outright hostility. He made his way back to his forge, finding it cold and undisturbed since his abrupt departure the previous day. As he rebuilt the fire and prepared to return to his craft, Sigurd reflected on how quickly life could change, how a single act of compassion toward a child had altered not only his own fate, but potentially the destiny of two clans long divided by hatred. The fire blazed to life beneath his careful tending, warmth gradually returning to the familiar space. Outside, children's laughter rang out as they resumed play in the fresh snow, already adapting to the strange new reality of a world where yesterday's enemies might become tomorrow's allies. Sigurd lifted his hammer, the weight familiar and reassuring in his hand. Whatever came next, peace or renewed conflict, trust or betrayal, he would face it as he faced the metal in his forge, with heat, pressure, and the patient understanding that transformation was never easy, never painless, but sometimes necessary to create something stronger than what came before. As shadows lengthened across the snow, marking the passage of this momentous day into history, Sigurd worked steadily, each strike of his hammer echoing the rhythm of a heart determined to forge something new from the raw materials of the past, a legacy of reconciliation rather than revenge, of bridges rather than barriers. In the great hall, the rejoined medallion lay on the table where Ira had placed it, the ancient silver catching the last rays of winter sunlight. The runes etched into its surface seemed to shift and change in the fading light, as if the old magic stirred once more after generations of slumber. Awakened by a child's courage, a blacksmith's compassion, and the first tenuous steps toward healing wounds so old they had become part of the landscape itself. That night, beneath skies cleared of clouds to reveal a canvas of stars, both settlements slept with fewer guards posted than in living memory. The old hatreds had not vanished. Generations of blood feuds could not be erased in a single day. But something had shifted, like the first faint crack in river ice that heralds the coming spring. And in that small opening, that narrow space between what had always been and what might yet be, hope took root. Fragile, vulnerable, but alive with possibility. That night, between the fire and the ice, they understood that compassion might indeed be a Viking's strongest weapon, one that could build rather than destroy, heal rather than wound, unite rather than divide. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.